In the previous episode, we permanently installed this rear carrier bearing mount but left it unfinished. In the bonus round, we hacked a tunnel for the e-brake cable so they wouldn't get pinched going over this mount, but the front mount didn't get permanently installed. Why? Why, you say? It's because the position of the front and rear carrier bearing mounts are what centers the Lowepro joint. I positioned the front mount where it needed to be and just tacked it in place. Then I welded this sharp piece of steel in the tunnel that shares space with where the shaft would be if it were installed. It helped me measure what needed to be shortened by scratching 2 marks in the shaft. The difference between those marks was how much I needed to have removed. I came up with 3.15 inches and sent it off to be shortened. I was told when I got it back that it's guaranteed to be within an 1/8 inch of my measurement. Since this could affect the position of the Lobro joint in the center shaft, I didn't weld in the front carrier bearing mount so that I could reposition it if I had to. When they shorten the shaft, they grind off the old weld and cut the shaft free from the yoke. If the yoke doesn't have at least 5/16 of an inch or 8 millimeters of a flange that slips inside the shaft, then they can't shorten it because they'll have nothing to weld it back to. DSMs have meaty flanges, so you can shorten them. I got some new grease, gloves, all the sockets and pullers out and ready to go, some WD cups, and all the parts that I ordered came in. This stuff is going to be familiar to some of you. I picked up the $70 Lobro boot that I tore while working underneath the car. Just like in the Driveshaft series I shot with Robert, I saved $30 a joint buying the yoke kits. And I picked up a brand new seal for my transfer case. I got new nuts and washers, even though I'm not replacing the carrier bearings. If you're just doing Lowbro joints and U-joints, you don't need these, but I needed spares for insurance. I know that any part of this work that I leave exposed will rust. I know that my seams need to be air and water tight, so I ordered 8 ounces of seam sealer to waterproof my work once it's all cleaned up. Once it's dried, it can't be removed by any solvent. You absolutely have to wear gloves and protect yourself from any exposure to this stuff. If it dries on you, it's not coming off unless that part of you dies and falls off. Last time we did this, we found 1 out of 3 yokes having mismatched snap rings. I only need to press 2 of these out, but I'm cleaning out all 3 to see if those averages still apply or if it was a fluke. Well, those averages hold true. Thanks a lot, Mitsubishi. I'm not doing anything differently than what you've seen before, just a whole lot faster. The last series of 5 videos about this took 40 minutes. I'm rolling through it in just 7. I'm pressing the joints out of 2 of the yokes first. One yoke will be installed on one end of the shaft as is, but what do you do with the old ones after you press the U-joints out? There's plenty of good uses for it. Use them to plug up your spare transfer cases. Remember spilling $30 worth of fluid everywhere and needing kitty litter in a previous video? This works much better. Make sure you don't install the yoke on the wrong end of the shaft. The yoke end used to be marked A. The B joint is on the Lobro side. I still don't have an 8/10,000th feeler gauge, and it really hasn't been high on my list of priority tool purchases. I have a feel for these, so I just mess with the snap rings until they're right. For those of you that are new here, I did a detailed 5-part series on rebuilding drive shafts. By the end of this video, if not already, the veteran subscribers are all going to be completely sick and tired of seeing drive shafts being rebuilt. This isn't the Driveshaft channel. Fortunately, this will be the last time I need to do this anytime soon, or at least I hope so. I do have 2 other all-wheel drive Mitsubishis, but I'll spare you those videos if I do. Nothing in it would be any different on the GSX, except the shape of the 2G carrier bearing mounts. The Galant would be identical to this, just longer. It's my fault this boot got ripped. The Lobro bolts come from the factory with red Loctite on all of them. There's no access for an impact wrench, and crescent wrenches will bend if you only apply gradual pressure. You need to shock the bolt with something to break the red Loctite loose. I don't know of a better way to do this than using 2 crescent wrenches and a 4-pound sledge. Once you cut the boot clip off, you're only a snap ring away from removing the Lobro joint. There was nothing wrong with this one that I'm aware of, and it never saw road use after the boot got ripped, so I'm just going to be cleaning, inspecting, and repacking it if it all checks out. Connecting the engine to the rear wheels is the most critical part of doing an all-wheel drive swap. Matching up the wheelbases will require messing with the drive shaft to get its length and pinion angles correct. It's just part of a process that everyone would have to do if they're attempting this job, and I intend to share my complete experience of the Colt's transformation. That's why you're seeing it again at warp speed. The body of this Lobro joint is in good shape. These are made from a super hard alloy steel, and it's unusual for them to fail unless they get water and dirt in them. That shows up as pitting. This wear looks normal, and I expected that. So I just need to clean it out, clean the thread locker off the bolts, inspect the bearings, and put it all back together again. Every auto shop needs a wire wheel and a bench grinder. This turns minutes worth of work into just seconds. Now to make sure none of these bearings are out of round. Every last one of them measured 0.749 inches, and we're good. Now for reassembly. Pay attention to lining up both gaskets, the bolt holes, and that the torque ring and clip are already past the boot before installing the Lowepro joint. If you don't have those pieces in place first, you're going to have a bad time. Reassembly is a balancing act. You want to put this all together at once. If you have to separate this for any reason during assembly, you're going to make a horrible mess and get grease everywhere. There's a specific volume of grease that must be maintained, so you don't want to spill any. That specific amount prevents grease from clogging the breather on the boot, preventing it from compressing, or from leaking out while it is at its full level sitting still. Air and grease both expand with temperature, so the Lobro joint needs to be able to breathe and move freely. Since my red Loctite was dried up, I'm using the blue stuff for principle. It's not the right stuff for doing this job. I'll fix it later. Sadly, I left that out of the other videos. Always use red Loctite on Lobro bolts. They don't require much torque, and you don't want them vibrating loose under any circumstances. Even I have to stop and watch a Jafromobile video for reference on occasion. This is my 7mm, and we set this to 25 foot-pounds. My mind is a rusty steel trap. It can clamp down on most things, but I never trust myself on torque specs without looking them up first. It's the whole measure twice thing. Now we just need to press in the last half of this U-joint and the whole drive shaft is reassembled. Time to slap this thing back underneath the car and see how it fits. You want the full length of the splines in this yoke to be engaged with the transfer case, or else it compromises the strength of both parts. As the engine torques and the transfer case moves with it, it effectively changes the length of the drive shaft. On a DSM, any lateral play in the drive shaft is absorbed by the Lobro joint. That's the reason the carrier bearings are suspended inside the rubber bushings on either side of it, so they can give. And the job of the Lobro joint is specifically to absorb that thrust. The key is to get the Lobro joint in its sweet spot, which is basically dead center on its wear marks. This needs to be accomplished while the front yoke stays buried in the transfer case and the rear is bolted up. The position of the front carrier mount will allow you to do this if the front shaft is the right length. You get a little wiggle room until you weld it in so you can fine tune it. Another thing to pay close attention to is its pinion angles. I can't find a spec for this, not for a DSM. All the documentation I've read is assuming you're working on a car that's already got factory mounts in the right locations. I'm not finding pinion angles in the service manual anywhere. Google and tuners are coming up short for me. I know that in rear-wheel drive drag setups, 2 to 3 degrees is usually a sweet spot for a one-piece drive shaft. but that factory cars sometimes come with 1 to 2 degrees. A DSM's 3-piece all-wheel drive shaft is mounted fairly straight on the other 2 cars in my driveway. Because this car wasn't specifically designed for this rear, in some ways I have to make it work with what I've got. But I'm going to try to stay around a 2 degrees difference between each shaft if I can manage to pull it off. I have a very slight right to left angle where everything fits, but if it were mounted perfectly straight, it would be a bigger problem than having those slight angles. The reason you don't want to mount these sections of the shaft perfectly straight is because the articulation is required to keep the needle bearings in the U-joints from flat spotting and seizing up. They need to move at least a degree in order to stay loose and lubricated. It's time to get this thing permanently mounted. First I need to cut the temporary mounts free to locate its final position, and to fit the templates for it that I made in the previous video. I intentionally didn't trim these into their final shapes, and I have to do a little bit of grinding to make them fit. I'm going to weld these to the mount and then finish the mount on the workbench. It's easier to weld on a workbench. I'm using the vise to crush the templates tightly against the mount before tacking them in place. I'm finally getting half decent at welding. I'm really happy how this turned out. I'll have very little cleanup work to do. I'm welding it all the way around through 2 separate layers of steel above it instead of the dozen pinch welds that held it in only 1 sheet of steel before. It's going to be many times stronger than the original part when I'm through. It also happens to line up directly underneath the unibody frame support that the shifter is bolted to. That goes all the way across the floorboard above this. We'll let that cool and then bolt down the mount. There you go. Now there's a factory fit all-wheel drive Colt hatchback. All the wheels work. I mounted the center shaft parallel to the frame of the car and added about 1.5 degrees of righty-lefty in between to make room for exhaust work, and so that the angles I put in on one side came back out evenly on the other side. The result underneath I'm thrilled about. The carrier bearings only protrude about 1/2 inch below the frame rails at their lowest points. Plenty of ground clearance. The exhaust will hang lower than that. It's very nicely tucked in there. Let's check these final pinion angles. On the first shaft I've got negative 0.8 degrees. It's negative because it's left of 0. On the center shaft we've got plus 2 degrees. That's a difference of 2.8 degrees. I said I wanted to keep the universal joints between 2 and 3 degrees, and that's it right there. The rear shaft is at 5.3 degrees. If you subtract the center shaft's 2 degrees, you get 3.3 degrees, and I think that's fantastic. That's not enough to hurt a Lowepro joint, just enough to keep the grease circulating. The two measurements I need in order to finish the math are the output on the transfer case and the rear differential flange. It looks like the rear differential is 6 degrees. The output shaft of the transfer case is at 2 degrees, the exact same angle as the center shaft. That means the U-joints at the first and second joints have identical operating angles. Here's a chart of what I've got based on how the car is jacked up in the air. The pinion angles are all acceptable, even a little better than I expected. Guys, I'm thrilled. It's official. It's an all-wheel drive Colt. There are some other changes I'm considering, but the bulk of the conversion is complete. Now I just need a fuel system, brake lines, coolant system, intake, exhaust, charging system, and some safety equipment, and I'll have the lightest GSX around these parts. I'm going to make all this pretty now, but this is enough for one video. It takes a few days for pour patch to fully dry, and I'd rather not make you wait. I thank all of you for your patience while I tackle this job, and I can't wait to bring you plenty more progress. You guys know the drill.